before we go to this afternoon's topic, is there any questions from the discussion group anyone would like to bring up?
This is a difficult question. I haven't framed it properly, but we were wondering if Buddhism is about faith. Like
About
faith. Because
fate or faith?
F-A-I-T-H. Faith.
Faith.
So, because of the, when we were talking about the mind, primordial consciousness, so if there is no way for the intellect to understand it, then how do we approach it?
Through experience.
Yeah, but that's the thing. How can we experience it in the mind? Right now, we just have to believe it, right?
No. In fact, the Buddha said, don't do that.
Right.
Just out of devotion to me, don't accept anything I tell you.
So how can we be sure that there is such a thing?
Through experience. We can come to experience it. But the intellectual mind is not that agent. We saw in the three levels of mind, the intellectual mind is the coarse mind. I mean, even to experience the subtle mind, we have to let go, we have to go beyond the intellectual mind. So, there's what's called in Buddhism the four alliances, which I won't go through, it's a whole big topic, but we are to rely more on direct experience than through the rational mind, reasoning. Direct experience is more valid than reasoning. That doesn't mean we abandon reasoning, but it means we need to go beyond reasoning and logic to direct experience. It's the same as, it's good to understand something in life logically, but even better is if we directly experience it. That is the best.
We experience things through our senses and they could...
We're not talking about experience through senses, we're talking about experiencing through the mind, mental consciousness.
But even the mind can be deluded, right?
Correct, so that's why we have to do the shamatha practice to make it into a functional tool. Otherwise it's completely deluded. We can come up with all sorts of fantasies. Exactly. That's like a scientist running an experiment with a faulty equipment. Comes up with all sorts of results. But fortunately, we have a way of making the mind a working tool, and it's called shamatha practice. If we have that, then we can really penetrate. But if we don't have that, you're right, we can come up with all sorts of fantasies.
Nirvana, enlightenment and stain of ignorance. Nirvana, enlightenment and stain of we could not get a clear understanding of it.
Yeah. So you don't have a clear understanding of nirvana, enlightenment, or stain of ignorance. These are all topics that we're going to talk about in more detail in the coming days. But just a brief answer now. Of course, nirvana is the state of liberation, freedom from suffering and its causes. And enlightenment is the next step. When we eliminate the stains in our mind, then we move to that next step of enlightenment. But we're going to talk more about that in the coming days, more detail.
We couldn't come up with any practical methods for dealing with the six conditions.
Did anyone else come up with any ideas of what we can do to help work with these 6 factors? Anyone got any suggestions?
Setting boundaries?
For which one of the 6?
Well, I guess it can kind of apply to all of them, but like society and media, maybe setting boundaries on how much you expose yourself to.
Yeah, so certainly society and media is, again, to set boundaries is to for society, of course, is to not unnecessarily get involved with people who always affect you in a negative way. Of course, we're not saying that whenever there's someone difficult, we run away. That's never a long-term solution. In fact, often the very people who are most difficult are the family members. But it could be an effective short-term strategy to step back a little bit so that we're working on ourselves, so that later we can go into these more difficult situations and maybe even help these people. But if we're going to situations where we're always reacting in a negative way, then that's not helpful for us or for them. So therefore, to set those boundaries is to give yourself some time and space to work on yourself, so you're not always negatively impacted, and then later we can maybe go back into those more difficult situations to help these people. And actually in Buddhism we often talk about conducive conditions for practice. And as a beginner, that often includes surrounding ourselves with supportive people. But actually, as we go further into the practice, what is conducive conditions changes. And actually, when we get more advanced in practice, the very people who are going to help us the most are these difficult people. We'll actually need to go and search them out. Because the thing is, if we're always surrounding ourselves with kind, nice, loving people, at some point we could have this illusion, you know, I'm very kind and compassionate, very patient. And I remember in one retreat, there was one, I think, American Buddhist teacher said something like, if you think you're really patient and kind and compassionate, go and live with your mother-in-law for 2 weeks.
Ram Dass.
Was it Ram Dass? Yeah. So again, we need to know what level we're at. And for most of us as beginners, we need to give yourself some space because we are so much easily influenced by other people and the media as well. Any other suggestions about how we can work with these?
I feel like the third step, like intention.
Inappropriate attention?
Yeah, could be easier to correct.
How? What practical advice do you have?
Before we act, ask ourselves, what's the intention?
Intention. So we're in a situation and we're about to react with either anger, jealousy, craving, whatever. So we're in that situation. So what can we do in a practical way to work with step 3?
I know it's still hard, but try to ask ourselves why I'm doing this.
Why you're reacting?
Yeah, what kind of situation I'm really in?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of expectation I have?
What intention? Yeah.
What expectation? Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe put yourself instead of the object, and after that, before your inappropriate attention to it, so put yourself instead of the object.
Switch places? You mean if it's another person?
Yeah, see the situation from
a different perspective. Yeah. Yeah. That's very good. I mean, one of the, as we're going to see a little bit more in the coming days, one of the reasons we have this is we tend to have very narrow perspective of most situations, and our perspective usually is, how is this situation affecting me? And we don't really take into consideration if there are other people there, how it's affecting them or how they're seeing things. It's always from this me perspective. And as long as we have that, then we're on shaky ground. And we often then tend to have a very narrow perspective. So yes, it can be, whenever we're interacting with other people, one thing that can be very good, and we'll talk more about this later, is always put yourself in the shoes of the other person. How is this person seeing the situation? And even better, a third person perspective of someone outside looking at both people. How are they seeing the situation? So at least second person perspective, but third person is even better.
I have 2 questions. So to continue with that, aren't you then not filling it in for someone else?
Are you what, sorry?
Like if you're looking, you try to look from the other person's perspective, aren't you like filling the situation in for the other one?
Right, so of course we can never know what that person's thinking, but we can, based on what they're saying and behaving, we can approximate. But the main reason to do this is just to get rid of this sort of me perspective. And yeah, of course we can't never know for sure, but if we do that, then see, when we react with attachment, aversion, jealousy, or whatever, that mental affliction is really seeing that person as an object, a thing, that is either seems to be the source of my happiness or the source of my suffering. So at least if we put them in, we can see them as a person rather than as an object. So already that's going to help reduce that reaction. One more.
Another question. The first question is regarding like the practical methods for dealing with attachment. We couldn't really come up with an answer.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any practical method they use already that helps them with attachment?
We kind of said in our group, like, now that we've had these enlightening discussions, it's like, first of all, find out what your attachment is, and then when you become aware of it, like, check yourself and try and take steps to not be attached and to gradually become detached, but also compassionate, because just because you suddenly realise, you're not just going to go, okay, I'm detached now, bye. It's because we don't work like that. We need to do it slowly,
Right.
And understand that it will take time to become disattached.
Sure. I mean, we need to be kind to ourselves and not have unrealistic expectations. But actually, just on one word there, and sometimes we see that, when we let go of attachment, we see this word detached. But personally, I don't like that word, because it's sort of, sometimes we use the word detached to mean we sort of don't care about anything. So I think a better word is non-attachment, because detached has a sense of disconnecting, and we're not talking about disconnecting. That can be quite pathological, disconnecting. And unfortunately, that's what we often do, because we can't deal with situations, we disconnect. And then we become very apathetic and indifferent. Couldn't care less what happens to anyone, I don't care. That's not healthy. So they're the two extremes. Either we get caught up and react, or we disconnect. So what we're talking about is staying completely connected, but not reacting. So that, a better word probably is non-attachment.
And then practical, how do you non-attach?
Yeah. That's one of the topics we're going to talk about tomorrow morning, but a brief answer now is that the first step, as suggested here, is first recognise when attachment's arisen. That's one of the main keys, because usually what happens is it's only when we're really caught up in it, then we realise we're caught up, and then it's a bit late because our mind is already out of control. But there's a little window of opportunity from when attachment or anger or anything starts to come up until the point where it's got control of our mind. If it's got control of our mind, about really the only thing we can do is get out of that situation fast before we say and do things we're going to regret. But the key, of course, is to catch it before it gets to that point where we're already out of control, and we can only and that window may only be a second or two. And normally we can't catch it because we only realise until it's too late. So one thing that's going to be very helpful for that is this mindfulness, which we are developing in shamatha practice. We're strengthening mindfulness. We talked about, when we were talking about the 3 levels of mind, we said with the mind we have now called the coarse mind, we have this sort of bandwidth, and we have this threshold. And here is what we're aware of, the conscious, and this is subconscious. So what's happening, of course, is anger, craving, attachment starts down here, and it's going like this, and it's building, we're not knowing, and it's only when it pops its head up here, we realise, and then usually by then, we're already out of control. But if we do shamatha practice, this threshold will go down here, and so we'll be able to pick it up very early, and we're still in control. And then we've got an opportunity to do something. What we can do then, we're going to talk about tomorrow morning in more detail.
By the definition, it says that, attachment would...
So I missed the first part. Definition?
The definition of attachment, it says that you'd want to eventually possess it, because it... Does that mean that when you're practicing detachment or non-attachment, that you wouldn't want to possess anything?
Possess means it's mine.
Like possessions in life.
Yeah, but I don't mean, I own this watch.
Right.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about, this wanting to... It's basically in terms of that we believe it's the source of our happiness. So we're not talking about possession in terms of ownership. Although that already is starting to slide that way. I mean, even that is already on shaky ground. My watch, you better not touch my watch. No. Oh, their watch? Oh, I don't care. You can do what you want. It's still a watch. So, but there's a little bit of a difference there in that definition. It's this, the idea that this is a source of my happiness.
Like if someone who's never had the economic opportunity to drink wine, for example, and they walk into your house and open the fridge and drink your wine, would then that translate into attachment as well? Because you'd obviously feel that that's your wine and not theirs.
But then that would be more the flip side of that, the aversion.
We couldn't come out with an answer to the third question because we didn't have clear what is mind for Buddhism.
So the theory of mind, of course, we only just really gave a very brief introduction into that. And so we're going to touch on that in many different ways, of course, in the coming days. But of course, the answer really lies through experience. So already, I think yesterday with Felipe, you were doing a little meditation looking at the nature of the mind and continuity of the mind and so forth. So we really will begin to appreciate what is the mind through experience, by observation. I mean, it's like everything in science. If we want to know something well, we observe it closely. And so here, if we want to know the mind well, we need to observe it closely. I mean, just reading about it in a book, well, that will help a little bit, but if we really want to know the mind, we need to observe it. And so that's what we're doing in the shamatha and vipassana practices, and we'll be introducing, in fact, tomorrow we'll start a shamatha practice exactly this, to observe the mind, to know it better, to understand it better. And then vipassana, of course, even more deeper insight into the mind. So that's still to come.
Can you attach also to like negative emotions?
You can become attached to anything.
Like for example, I don't know, you're happy, but all of a sudden it feels like you need to create suffering.
You can be attached to anything. You can be attached to meditating, you can be attached to nirvana, you can be attached to anything. Whatever we're attached to, it's not going to end well. Any last questions before we move to this afternoon's topic? Okay. So this morning, or today, we're looking at the second noble truth. The truth of the cause or origin of suffering or dukkha. And so we saw this morning that there are these two elements that are identified as within the second noble truth. The first, of course, was the mental afflictions. So we had a look at the three poisons this morning, particularly a little bit of ignorance, attachment and aversion. Aversion in terms of anger. And the second element that was identified there is actions, or in Sanskrit the word karma. So what we saw this morning in this suffering and its causes chart, we looked at that process of how our distorted view of reality, in particular here, this grasping onto independent me, independent world, leads to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and all the other mental afflictions come out of that, and that's driving our behaviour. and then the Buddhist assertion is that every action we do based on mental affliction has a result, and the result are our experiences. So what we're going to look at now this afternoon is this process from step 5 to 6, how our actions lead to our experiences. And so we're going to talk about karma, which is the Buddhist theory of causality in terms of actions and experiences. So just as we see the principle of causality operating in the physical world, similarly Buddhism says also in our mental world we have this principle of causality operating in terms of our actions and our experiences. The word karma literally means action, but when we talk about this principle or theory of karma, we're talking about a process. And that is that every action we do leaves what's called an imprint on our mind, and that imprint later ripens as a result, and of course the result is all of our experiences. But technically speaking, karma means action, but it's talking about this process. Now, of course, this principle or theory of karma is, of course, embedded in the Buddhist worldview. So first we have to check our assumptions when we listen to this theory. Because if we have a materialistic view, in other words, we believe that the mind is the brain, or a property of the brain, or emergent property of the brain, then a lot of these things will simply not make sense. And if we hold the belief that the mind begins at the beginning of the life and it will end at the end of this life, then a lot of these things won't make sense. And also if we have this view that there's an independent me here and an independent objective world out there, then a lot of these things will simply not make sense. So the Buddhist theory of course of karma is based on the Buddhist theory of mind, on the idea of conservation of consciousness, and the understanding of interdependent nature of reality. So what I can suggest is that after we've covered particularly the third one, this idea of interdependent nature of reality, later, is to come back after that and have a look at these principles and see whether you make some different sense of them. So let's now look at karma. And when we talk about karma or action, we're really primarily focusing on this mental factor called intention. Intention. And so therefore we can talk about two types of karma. So we can talk about intention itself, and then what's called intended actions, which are the verbal and physical actions based on that intention. So karma can either be mental, verbal, or physical. So karma is not just the things we say and do, but it's also the things we think. So already if we have a thought with intention, this is already karma. But then of course if we act on that verbally or physically, then that's of course bringing it to another level. But just to be aware, of course, already thoughts with intention is already karma. And we can talk, another way of dividing up karma is in terms of the different results that we can experience. We can talk about virtuous karma or virtuous actions, non-virtuous and neutral karma or actions. And virtuous action is any action that brings a happiness result. Non-virtuous actions are any actions that bring a suffering result, and neutral actions is any action that brings a neutral result. So whether or not something is virtuous or non-virtuous is determined by the result it brings. And of course, a lot of our actions can be a mix, because we can have maybe a good intention, but we do an action that creates harm, or vice versa. We can have not a very good intention, but somehow some benefit comes out of that. So some of our actions, or in fact a lot of actions, can be a mix of the two. But that then leads us to what's called the general principles of karma.
So the three types relate to intention and intended action?
Yeah.
Could you call the three types three forms instead, just because it seems a bit like...
Three forms.
There's two types and then there's three types.
Well, again, it's just different ways of dividing.
Okay.
I mean, you can with anything, a group of things you can divide up in different ways. Is you can say there's 3 of those or 4 of those, or so. Again, type is in terms of because we can have 3 types of result. We can talk about 3 types of action, because there's 3 types of result. There's pleasure, suffering, and neutral experiences.
Does it always have to be an intention? Can you always? So unintentionally, if you create harm.
So this is so intention is the key factor, but as we're going to see a bit later, it's not the only factor. There are many other factors, because we can talk about what's called the weight of our karma of actions, and the main thing that will not the only thing, but the main thing that determines the weight is intention. For example, there's a big difference between intentionally doing something knowing it's harmful versus doing exactly the same thing not understanding it's harmful. I mean, it's still harmful, but the result will be a lot bigger if we know it's harmful and we still do it, versus we didn't know it's harmful and we do the same action. So intention is one of the key elements. So we can talk about general principles. And there are 4 general principles here, and actually these are the same general principles we see operating within the physical world of causality. And the first general principle is that karma or action is certain or definite. What this means is that just as in the physical world, we see that, if we plant an apple seed, we will always get an apple tree. We plant orange seed, we always get orange tree. Meaning it's certain or definite that the result is always of a similar type to the cause. So similarly here, what's certain or definite is that if you do a virtuous action, you will always get a happiness result. If you do a non-virtuous action, you always get a suffering result. So that's what certain or definite means. It means that if you do a harmful action, you can't get a happiness result. If you do a virtuous action, you can't get a suffering result. But of course here, we have to understand this cause and result. Because often, what we do is we mistakenly connect two things together which do not have a causal relationship. For example, let's say I steal some money. And then immediately upon stealing money, I have wealth. So it seems like stealing is the cause of wealth. But what this is saying is that's not possible. This. Not possible. What's happening, and there's no causal relationship there between stealing and having wealth. They just happen to have, one happens to happen immediately after the other, and we mistakenly link the two as one causes the other one. What this principle is saying here is that us stealing, all that has happened is that we have created an imprint in our mind that will later ripen as us seeing someone stealing something from us. So that we need to, that's what this is saying here, is that there's no, just because one thing happened after the other, doesn't mean they're causally related. So, and in fact, on that principle, what is the cause of wealth is generosity, not stealing. But we mistakenly link the two together and we think, oh, stealing causes money, causes wealth. But this principle is saying that's impossible. Because just like when we plant a seed in the ground, we don't instantly get a tree. Likewise, if you do an action, there's no such thing as instant karma. You can't do an action and instantly have a result. There's a maturation period, just like in the physical world. So that's the first general principle, that karma or action is certain or definite, meaning the result is always of a similar type to the cause.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Right. If you plant an apple seed, you always get apple tree.
Right?
I
mean, the part of if you steal, you get wealth.
So there's no relationship there at all.
Why not?
Because that would mean that, is stealing the cause of wealth? We're talking causal relationship. Remember yesterday we talked about cause and cooperative conditions.
Okay.
So what caused the plant? Not the water, not the sunlight, not the soil, but the seed.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're saying that the stealing causes wealth, we're saying that stealing transforms into wealth. Which means, if that's the case, it means that everyone who's wealthy must have stolen, because the cause of wealth is stealing.
Okay.
Is that the case?
No.
Well, then that's proof that the cause of wealth is not stealing.
But
could it be a condition? Yes. But we're looking for the cause here.
Like the main cause.
Well, the only cause. I mean, with the seed plant analogy, We said yesterday there's what's called...
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. So, what is the cause of the plant? It's not the water, it's not the soil, it's not the fertilizer, sunshine. I mean, that's a contributing factor, but the cause is the seed, only the seed.
Okay.
That's a causal relationship.
Okay.
So that's what we're looking for here. Can there be other factors that contribute to wealth? Sure, but we're looking for the cause. And if the cause of wealth is stealing, it would mean that everyone who's wealthy would have had to have stolen, because that's the cause of wealth.
Well, couldn't you say then, if the cause is generosity, wouldn't everybody who's generous be wealthy?
Right, and the problem here is this time gap.
Right.
Yeah.
So it could be in another lifetime or something.
Yeah, so that's one of the points we're going to come up here. That, like, just in the physical world, when you plant a seed, you don't instantly get a tree. There's a whole process. And so that's this process of action, imprint, and so forth. How long does that process take? How long does a seed take to become a plant? Well, it could be slow, it could be quickly, depending if you give fertilizer and so forth. So similarly, that's the big problem here, is that there is this time between the action and the experience, and it's hard for us to tie the two together. So what we mistakenly do is what we tie together is what happens next. We do an action, what happens next? Oh, that must be causing that. But there's no logic there. Just because something happens after something doesn't necessarily mean there's any causal relationship. And if there is a causal relationship, it must be consistent. But if it was consistent, it would mean, again, that everyone who's wealthy must have stolen.
Is there any exception to the rule?
To this,
Yeah, because perhaps someone who was wealthy was given the money, or maybe they did steal, or maybe there was a different way that they got there.
well, then we're saying there's no causality, which could be a theory. I mean, it could be just random. But this is saying that that's not the case. That it's not random.
Why are we trying to find only one cause? Maybe there are a lot of forces as well.
Yeah, but here we're talking about cause, not conditions. There can be many conditions, of course. But in the physical world, we have one cause, but many conditions. Yes, there can be many conditions. So the second point is that the principle of increase. So again, just as in the physical world, if you plant a small seed, you can end up with a big tree. So similarly here, you can do a small action, meaning not such a big intention, and you can still get a big result. Because just like in the physical world, if you plant a small seed and you nurture that, you give it a lot of water and fertilizer and sunlight and so forth, you can end up with a big tree. So similarly, even if we do a small action, but we nurture that by being happy about doing it and doing it again and again and again and again, we can end up with a big result. So that's this one here, increase. The third general principle is not done, no result. As in the physical world of causality, if there's a result, there's always a cause. You can't get something from nothing without a cause. Similarly, we can't have a result, an experience, without having done an action. That's what not done, no result means. And the fourth general principle is one of what's called not wasted. So again, just as in the physical world, if you plant a seed in the ground, there's definitely a seed in the ground. It's not like some seeds you plant sort of disappear into space. Similarly, if we do an action, definitely an imprint is planted in our mind. It's not like some actions disappear into space. But just as with the physical world, the seed, there's definitely a seed in the ground, but what happens to that seed is not certain. I mean, if we give a lot of water and fertilizer and so forth, we can end up with a big result. If we don't give so much fertilizer or water, smaller result. If we don't give any water or we put poison in the ground, no result. But it's still there. So similarly, even though if we do an action, definitely there is an imprint in our mind. This doesn't disappear. But what happens to that? Not sure. If we rejoice and happy and keep doing it, big result. If we don't, maybe smaller result. If we poison the seed by what's called purifying the mind, maybe no result. So this brings in here what's called purification, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Because with these general principles, if we've done a harmful, non-virtuous action, then we've planted a seed imprint in our mind that will ripen as some sort of suffering experience in the future. We don't particularly want that. But we can do things to that imprint to reduce the result or even to stop it ripening, like poisoning the seed in the ground. And so this is all about purification, and we'll talk about tomorrow how to purify our mind of these negative imprints, because we don't want them to ripen, because they'll ripen as some sort of suffering experience. So we'll talk about that tomorrow. So these are the 4 general principles of karma. Any questions about that? And otherwise I'll move on to the next topic.
Could you give an example of the increase?
Yeah, increase. We give something small, food to someone, or a little bit of money. But then we're very happy about doing that. We keep doing it. So we think if we did something small, we should get something equivalent back, small. But what this is saying is that if we do that, and we're really happy about that and keep doing that, we may get a big something in return. This is an example.
Number 3, not done, no result. If somebody gets an unexpected huge amount of wealth from somewhere, not related, not connected, so how come?
Yeah, again, if we have the assumption that the mind begins at the beginning of this life, there's no answer to this question. Of course not, because bad people have good things happen to them, and vice versa. So if we assume that it begins at the beginning of this life, then of course it won't make sense. Of course not. So that's what I said at the beginning. If that's our assumption, then you can't answer it. Well, it'd be difficult to answer these questions, wouldn't it? Exactly.
Are we assuming that getting a lot of wealth is a good thing?
Generally, we need wealth to have food and a roof over our head and medical cover, and some wealth is, for most of us, essential to survive. And then, of course, if we've got money, we can help other people more. So even better.
Yeah, sorry, that was not my question. So the book says here, karma doesn't disappear. Even after many lifetimes, we carry karma from one lifetime to the next.
Correct.
So this is point number 4, which is not wasted.
Correct.
Now, even in Hinduism, we have the same concept. However, it feels like the way it is propagated is more to encourage people to do good deeds in this life, so that they are more motivated and less motivated to do bad deeds.
Good.
Is this the same thing?
Good. Anything that motivates us to do less harmful and more good is great, no? It's an improvement of what we're doing before. But what we're going to see in the coming days is there are many levels that we can approach this at. And of course what we're going to see is at the highest level we're not even doing it for ourselves. Forget about this life or next life, we're doing it for others. So first we can be very selfish in doing it for ourselves in this life. We can then build on that and go a little bit further. So there are many levels we can do this. So what saying here is that the minimum starting level is just stop doing harm. I mean, that's just creating suffering for ourselves and everyone. So start there and then work our way up from that.
But then it's very difficult to make a case when somebody says or somebody observes that a person who has been stealing all their life or lying all their life, they're in general very happy, or they have...
No, they're never happy. I mean, maybe they got some material wealth, but most people who do this are not happy at all. Because they've got a lot of enemies, they're very stressed out, everyone's trying to get their money. I mean, generally people who are like this, deep down they're quite miserable. Surface-wise, oh yeah, I've got lots of money, but more often than not, these people are suffering mentally enormously already. And Buddhism said there's a lot worse to come. But even before that, now they're suffering often a lot mentally. I mean, they're usually very unhappy people, and they don't have any friends really.
For the third point, not doubt. If someone had a bad intention but did not finish the action, is there karma?
Yeah. So we won't go into that here because there's a whole thing we can talk about. But in terms of the weight of our actions, it depends on not only intention, but did we fully carry through with that or not? Who did we do that towards? You know, there are many, many factors, and that's one of them that will affect the heaviness or the weight of our action.
About number 4, you said that there are some actions that make an imprint, but for some reason, no result.
Not some reason. We have to do something.
Oh, that.
Purification.
Yeah, for some reason that I cannot remember now.
Purification.
Purification. So the process of karma is not completed. This process.
Well, it's complete. It's just that the seed never has the imprint never has the potential to ripen. It's like a poison seed in the ground.
Okay, so it can just finish there, like action, input, nothing else.
Yeah, there will be no ripening result because we have nullified the imprint. Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, we have a lot of mafias and smugglers. They gather well due to all bad things, and on the flip side, they do so much charity. So what about that? What is
Well, the charity they do, they'll get some good result in the future, and for the stealing and so forth, they'll end some suffering. So they're going to have a mixed future. Mixed future. So it depends on sort of the balance. Are they doing more stealing or more helping? That's going to depend how much of the suffering and how much good they're going to have in the future.
It doesn't matter how you get your wealth. If you do charity, you will get some good out of it.
Some, but of course, there's going to be a big... But the thing is that already doing charity, but then you're stealing, that stealing is already weakening the imprints of charity. It is. Which means that, you know, if person A does some charity and person B does exactly the same charity, but then in addition person B goes stealing, then the result of that charity for the two people will be very different. The person who goes on stealing, the result of their charity will be much, much less in the future. Much less.
But if you're stealing from bad people...
But again, you'll still have a result. But again, it's all to do here.
But it's the point that can pass to another life if you don't remember it, and it's like another person that you don't even will meet or anything.
Right, we're going to talk about this, but for example, let's say you only have short-term memory. So next week you don't remember this week. Would you do something now to your body that would the person that you'll be next week that would harm that body now? Would you do that? No. Even though you don't remember next week, you don't remember back. You still wouldn't do it, would you? And actually, I think if this is really true, we'd be very thankful that actually whoever it was there in the past did a lot of good that we're now in this situation.
So where do you place Robin Hood, who steals money from rich and
You'll have a mixed result. So based on these general principles, what we can understand is that if we don't want suffering in the future, then we should really avoid harmful behaviour. And so then by reflecting on these sorts of principles, that would hopefully motivate us to adopt an ethical lifestyle. And generally in Buddhism here, when that's presented, it talks about 10, remember karma or action is not only verbal and physical, but also mental. So then we often have a list of 10 harmful behaviours that we should avoid. And so then the ethical basis is often presented as avoiding these 10 harmful behaviours. Don't do these things. But what I'd like to do is present them a little bit different than they're normally presented, because for a number of reasons. One is, in our modern society, we have so much focus on the negative. So I think it's helpful to focus on the positive opposite. And also, generally, we don't like people telling us what not to do. And also, if we say don't do this, don't do that, we're still focusing on that negative thing. For example, Mother Teresa, I think, once said that she would never ever attend an anti-war rally, but she would always attend a peace rally. And also, for example, let's say we're leaving home at one time and we have to take some keys with us. And often we go, don't forget the keys, don't forget the keys, don't forget the keys. So what do? We walk out the door without the keys, because what registers in our mind is forget the keys, forget. So we forget. So better than don't forget the keys, say remember the keys, remember the keys. So it's much better to focus on the positive opposite, and particularly in our modern society, so much focus on the negative. And I think you'll find that the list that we're going to produce here is a much better basis than for ethical basis for life. But first, there was a question here.
Is it right that in enlightenment you're sort of beyond duality, right? So how can we then say what's good or bad?
At the deepest level, a harmful behaviour is any behaviour that is out of sync with the interdependent nature of reality.
Sometimes what's good for someone is bad for someone else.
But again, what we have to do with a lot of these actions is we have to look at the bigger picture and look at short-term and long-term. And the reality is we'll be faced with many situations in our life where whatever we do, some harm will come. So then we pick the one that is least harm.
But if your intention is good, but it's wrong for the other people,
Well, that's why we have to have wisdom with our intention. It's not good enough just to be compassionate, because sometimes we create a lot of suffering because we don't have wisdom. So intention is the key in terms of good motivation, but we need to add wisdom. Otherwise, we can do a lot of things that create a lot of harm. So I want to list the 10 virtues in a sort of a flip side, the positive opposite. So the first non-virtue is killing. So what's the positive opposite of killing?
Saving life.
Saving life, that's quite proactive. What would be the minimum positive opposite?
Not killing.
Preserving is, again, quite... Nurturing is more... these are all great, but what would be the minimum?
Respect.
Respect life. And here, in terms of not killing, often people ask, do you have to be a vegetarian to be Buddhist? And the answer is no. Because we need to understand this in a sensible way. Because there are many gradients of not killing. For example, if we kill other human beings, of course, we will end up in prison. But then, of course, we can go to the next level of also then not killing any animals. And then we can go to the next level of becoming vegetarian, so we're not indirectly killing animals by eating meat. But then even if we're vegetarian, we can understand, well, there's some things I eat where animals are harmed, so I better become vegan. But even if we're vegan, then a lot of the things we eat, grains and fruit and veg, maybe a lot of bugs and insects are being killed through pesticides and that, so I actually better become organic vegan. But then even if we're organic vegan, still when grains are harvested and potatoes and stuff are dug out of the ground, things are getting killed. So maybe I just better become a fruitarian, eating fruit that drops from trees. But even then, they may drop and kill bugs when they hit the ground. So that's also a bit dicey. So maybe I better not eat anything. In fact, maybe I better not go out of the house, because if I go walking somewhere I might walk on bugs, so I'll stay inside. But even if I stay inside, maybe I accidentally swallow a mosquito or a fly, so I better wear a mask over my face. So what we can see here is that whatever level, harm will happen. It's a fact of life. So what the message, the respect life, what this is really saying is that at whatever level we can practically manage to try to reduce our harm on the planet. So if we can become vegetarian in a practical way, great. I mean, of course, remember in ancient Tibet, if they didn't eat meat, they died, basically, because there was no vegetables. But now, of course, a lot of them in India here, and so Dalai Lama is encouraging these Tibetans who used to be meat eaters to be vegetarians. And so, of course, then if it's practical to become vegan, great. Organic vegan, great. I mean, we can go along this spectrum and try as best we can from our own side to minimise the negative impact on the planet. What we don't want to do is take the moral high ground and condemn people who are operating at a lower level than us. This is, of course, cognitive fusion. Rather, encourage others to be less harmful in a good way. So I think this is the essence of this first one of respecting life. The second one, yeah.
What does Buddhism think about plant life?
Plant life is life, but it's not what's called sentient being, because sentient being means something with a mind. Does plant react to stimulus? Of course. Does it have a mind? According to Buddhism, no, because it doesn't have a complex enough physical structure to support the mind. The Buddhist assertion is that you need at least a sort of primitive neurosystem to support mind. But of course, we should also respect the planet in terms of plants and trees, because that's the habitat we live in, of course.
But in Buddha himself says, in some of his past lives, he was a tree, he was a rock.
No, I don't think so. I've never read that. Maybe it's true, but I've never read that. So the first one was killing. The second one, non-virtuous, is stealing. So what's the positive opposite of stealing? Giving is, yes, very good, proactive. What would be the minimum positive opposite?
Respect other properties.
Respect others' property. The third non-virtue is sexual misconduct, and that is defined as any sexual activity that creates harm to ourselves or others. So what's the positive opposite of sexual misconduct? Exactly. I think it's the same idea here. Is usually sexual misconduct comes because we're forcing something onto someone against their will. So therefore, respecting others' space or boundaries, or just generally respecting others. So those are the 3 physical actions. Then we have 4 verbal behaviours. The first one is the non-virtue is lying. So what's the positive or opposite of lying? Right. The 5th non-virtue is what's called divisive speech. And divisive speech is any speech where our intention is to cause 2 people or 2 groups of people to move apart. So what would be the positive opposite of divisive speech? Uniting speech, bringing people together. The 6th non-virtue is what's called harsh speech. And harsh speech is any speech whereby our intention is to hurt the person by what we say. So what's the positive opposite of harsh speech? Kind speech. The 7th non-virtue is what's called senseless speech or idle gossip. Now here we're having the top 10 list, but senseless speech or idle gossip seems quite harmless. So why does it make the top 10 list?
Because it plants seeds of negativity,
Of
negativity, and which may or may not be true, and then people view others in this way.
But we're talking senseless speech, not speech where we're talking bad about others. That's not senseless speech. That's the previous one, harsh speech. So why does it make the top 10 list?
It deviates us from the path.
Right.
Because it
would be harmful to the other
reduces the value of speech.
It leads to another type of speeches.
Possible, but I'm looking for something more simple than that. Waste of time. We just spend so much time going blah, 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 blah. So it's just a big time waster. And one of the topics that we're going to come up with a little bit later is this idea of a precious human life, but we don't have unlimited time. And then often you hear people say, oh, let's kill some time. As if we've got like oodles of time up our sleeve. So what's the positive opposite of senseless speech? Meaningful speech, yes. So those are the 4 verbal behaviours, but of course if we don't address mental attitudes, then it's going to be hard to restrain ourselves verbally and physically. So the last 3 is to do with the mental. So the 8th one normally is translated as the non-virtue is translated as covetousness, which is often defined as wanting something that belongs to someone else. So what's the positive opposite of this? And for this I can think of 2 things. What's the positive opposite of that? Of wanting something that belongs to someone else?
Generosity.
Independency.
Sorry?
Generosity.
Being
satisfied with what we have.
Being content with what we have.
You have to consider gratitude.
There's one other here.
Being happy with someone else?
Being happy for others. Rejoicing in others' good fortune. The ninth non-virtue is what's called ill will or malice, and that is wishing that others suffer, wish harm on them. So what's the positive opposite of ill will or malice?
Compassion?
Yeah, loving kindness and compassion, wishing them happiness and wishing them to be free of suffering. And the 10th non-virtue is what's called wrong view. And wrong view, and particularly here, the wrong view that is pointed at most is the wrong view that there are no consequences to my actions, so I can do whatever I want. So what's the positive opposite of wrong view? Right view.
Right
Maybe
mind.
you can say even just wisdom. So these are the mental. So I think this is quite a good list to use as a basis for ethical lifestyle, to respect life, respect others' property, respect others in general, tell the truth, bring people together, use kind and meaningful speech, being content with what we have, rejoicing in others' good fortune, loving kindness, compassion, and wisdom. So I think this is a very good ethical basis. Any questions on that? Yeah.
About telling the truth, but if the truth is harmful for others.
But then we've fallen into number 6, harsh speech.
So you have to tell the harmful truth in a good way.
Harmful truth.
Like, it's harmful for other people. Maybe they're gonna get hurt by the truth.
That's why we have to always use wisdom and compassion.
So you're not telling the truth in this?
Well, yeah, you tell the truth, but you do it skillfully. But often we tell the truth to humiliate people in public, don't we? Sometimes. That's not really telling the truth. That's using the truth to hurt people. So that's not really telling the truth.
Is wisdom is a choice?
Wisdom is a choice. What do you mean?
Can everybody be wise?
Can everyone be wise? Yeah, I mean, of course. Of course. Why not? But there's a difference between being smart and being wise. Smart is intellectual, wise is experiential. Many people can be smart and be do very lot of bad things. No? Because they're smart, they know how to do things in a devious way. So being smart is not necessarily a good thing. But being wise is being experiential. And being wise is really in harmony with the interdependent nature of reality. But we'll talk more about this in the coming days.
If the truth give pain for the other person,
Yeah.
you must tell the truth.
But again, you have to check your motivation. If you have a motivation to help, then sometimes people need to understand that what they're doing is harmful or something. But again, we have to check our motivation, our intention. Do we really want to help them, or do we want to use the truth to sort of humiliate them or embarrass them or so forth? And then, of course, we need to add wisdom to know how to do that skillfully so they won't react in a negative way.
About number 1, respect life. What says Buddhism about abortion?
Well, of course, abortion is killing, but again, we have to use wisdom and compassion. So, you know, for example, if mother is pregnant and if she carries on, she may die due to complications, then we have to weigh that up. But, you know, using abortion as contraception, I mean, I think that's definitely not okay. No? So, you know, and sometimes we have to use wisdom and compassion to decide what to do. And many times we're faced with a decision where there's harm either way, and we just have to use as much wisdom and compassion to decide what's the best thing to do. I mean, there's no book you go to that says do this. Every situation is unique. We have to evaluate every situation on its own merit, and then using as much wisdom and compassion as we have, we decide what is the best course of action. And of course, sometimes we make a mistake, but then we don't beat ourselves up. We learn from that, and next time we improve on that. I mean, that's all we can do.
Does Buddhism talk about the purpose of life?
The purpose of life, in what sense?
I mean, you mentioned that, you know, one shouldn't waste time in idle gossip, almost implying as if, I mean, and you also mentioned that the time is valuable, that there's only limited time. It almost sort of implies that there's a purpose and that we should all be living towards a certain goal, right?
Well, that's what we have to discover. So that's what all this is about, is to discover that. And the Buddha made discovery, and he said, this is what I discovered, so here's how you check that out. And often, like, often people talk about what is the basic human nature. And often we'll hear that they say, well, basic human nature is greed, is anger, is so-and-so, and you better get used to it, you know. And they ask the Dalai Lama what he thinks is the basic human nature, and he says caring. Caring is the basic human nature.
So that sort of solidifies the idea that Buddhism is more about social impact and helping society?
Yeah, but we have to understand that in a good way, of course.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, so, and we're going to talk about this later. And particularly, I think, the area where this really becomes very evident is when we look at the Buddhist view of reality, the interdependent nature of reality. But that's still to come.
Okay.
With the karma, can you do?
With karma?
With karma, can you do one bad thing in order to generate positive things?
Like I said, many actions can be mixed. And sometimes we're faced with difficult situations where there's a mixture of we're doing good things but bad things happen, and we just try to reduce the negative side and increase the positive side as much as possible. But we can't sort of, say that we do bad things, but something good's going to happen out of it. Because then we're going down a slippery slope. Because then we can probably justify every non-virtuous action. But this person's going to have some little benefit, so it's okay, I do it. No? So we have to understand what are the consequences of our actions, and then, again, use wisdom and compassion to decide how best to move forward.
What is karma? Like, where does it come from?
Where does it come from? Again...
It tracks your past actions over a long period of time.
Yeah. So remember, karma is not a thing. Karma is a theory or concept to describe process, what's going on. So simply describing the process of our actions and our experiences, that's all. This karma is not something floating in the air somewhere. I mean, like in the physical world, we talk about causality, cause and result. But that's just a principle that we have developed to understand what's going on. That's all.
Could it have been developed because we want to answer the question of good people suffering or bad people enjoying?
Well, again, what the Buddha discovered was that his experiences were coming from his previous actions. And of course, if the principle of karma helps people to be less harmful, that's a good thing. But of course, that's at a very basic level. I mean, at the deepest level, you'll understand that karma is just an expression of the interdependent nature of reality. But that's still to come.
Who controls karma?
No one controls. There's no controller. There's no one up there sort of running the show. Well, what we can say, who's the controller, is your mind. You are in control of your destiny, your future.
There is some instant karma, we can understand something is done in the morning and you get the result in the evening, there is fine. But sometimes you get after 20 years, 30 years. And what happens is that there is some kind of, divine justice, something that went wrong.
Justice.
And divine justice come after.
No, there's no one up there sort of meting out divine justice. The only one who is meting out divine justice is you yourself. So if you want to know who's in control, you. But of course, normally we're not in control because we just do whatever. So then, but basically, what we do now is going to determine what we're going to experience in the future. There's no one out there that's going to punish us for anything.
Is there a way to speed up the writing process?
Yeah.
Because it's like a...
So the point there is that we go back to intention. Is that the stronger the intention, the more quickly something will ripen. So that's why in Buddhism, in the spiritual path, motivation is key. And that's why later we're going to talk about this motivation called bodhicitta. Because this is a massive motivation. Which means if you do any action with that motivation, things will ripen much more quickly. Much more quickly. Much more powerful action and ripen much more quickly.
Doesn't that contradict the whole concept of karma? Because as you're doing the karmic actions, you should just be doing it because you want to, not because you...
Correct, and that's what bodhicitta is.
Yeah, and not
Bodhicitta is a completely unselfish motivation, exactly. Exactly, that's the point. That if two people do exactly the same action, and one does it with a selfish motivation and one completely unselfish, this one, of course, will be much more powerful. Much more. And the most powerful unselfish motivation is bodhicitta.
That was just...
Okay.
I do have a question. Going back to number one, what is the Buddhist view on eating meat?
On eating meat,
Yeah.
you're indirectly harming animals.
Okay, so what justification could meat eating have?
Sorry?
What justification could meat eating have?
That if you're in an environment where you didn't eat meat, you died, like in Tibet before. Nowadays, I don't know, maybe in remote Tibet it's the same, but in India not, so there's no justification there.
For some people that don't get vitamin D and you have to eat particular, like eggs and milk to be able to get that.
So again, it depends on not only the environment we're in, but also our physiological makeup, what need we need to sustain the body. But I think for most people in most environments now, we can be quite healthy without eating meat. But there may be exceptions to that, of course.
If unintentionally a bug is killed under
Is what, sorry?
If unintentionally a bug is killed under my feet, does it add to a karma? Or
Well, again, it depends. If you're going out somewhere where you see a lot of bugs and you say, I don't care, and walk across, then...
Unintentionally, I said. Unintentionally.
Yeah. No, I mean, if there's no intention, no. But again, we can't just say, I was ignorant, so therefore there's no problem. So we have to be, we can't use that as an excuse.
The concept of karma and Buddhism and Hinduism is the same or different?
I don't know, because I've never studied karma in Hinduism. I couldn't answer that.
I want to understand the difference between Buddhism and the other religion, for example, Hinduism. So here in Buddhism, do we say if we do good karma in this birth, are we improving our actions in this birth, or are we talking about the next birth?
Both. Both. Okay. I've got one more presentation and we're running out of time, and then if we get time, some more questions. So, what types of results can we experience? There's 4 types. The first 2 are what's called similar to the cause. And the first one is what's called similar experience, meaning, again, using the example of stealing, the one result of stealing is to have a similar experience, meaning later, at some point later, we see someone stealing something from us. So that's similar experience. But also we can have what's called similar tendency, which means, again, use that same example, if we steal, we're developing the habit of stealing. So that's what similar tendency means, is that we can then increase our habit of stealing in future. So that's a result of stealing, is that we now are developing the habit of stealing. So that's similar tendency. But then we can talk about the environmental result. And so here, if we have this idea that there's a fixed, objective, independent world, this one won't really make much sense. And to really appreciate this one, we have to go to this Buddhist view of interdependence. And environmental result is really how we're experiencing the world. Is also a result of our actions. But to really fully appreciate that, we have to understand how actually it's our mind that's creating our world of experience. And that's something that we're going to talk about still in a couple of days' time. But at a very simple level here, we could use maybe an analogy. Let's say we're in a beautiful place, but our mind is caught up in a lot of anger, then it doesn't really look that attractive if we're caught up in anger. It's not that, but it's a little bit like that. But again, to appreciate that, we have to understand how we are creating this world of experience. And that's coming in a couple of days' time. But there's one more result. Which is called the fully ripened result. And this is actually talking about our very life that we have now. Is that the life we have now, this life, is the fully ripened result from the previous life. And we're going to look at this process, how this works tomorrow. Because tomorrow we're going to look at the whole death rebirth process according to Buddhism. So what this is saying here is that at the end of this life, one of our imprints will ripen, which is going to determine what our next life is going to look like. That's the fully ripened result. But again, we'll talk about that in more detail tomorrow. So these are the 4 types of results. And very briefly, and we've touched on this already, when can we experience, if we do something right now, when can we expect to experience the result? There are basically 3 options, well 4 really. Sometime in the not too distant future, in this life. The second option is in the next life. The third option is sometime distant future. And the fourth option we don't, because we've purified it. So they're the 4 options. And how, as we said here, one of the factors that determine how quickly things ripen is intention, motivation. The stronger the motivation, either on the positive or the negative side, the more quickly things ripen in this life. So they're the 4 options. Sometime a little bit later in this life, the next life, sometime distant future, and the 4th option, it never ripens because we've actually purified that. How we purify, we'll talk about tomorrow, of course.
what about good actions?
Same. Good action, same. Good and both.
But how good action will get some result?
Yeah. Soon, next life, future, not ripen because we counteracted that by negative things. We purify the good actions by doing the negative stuff.
Besides purification, is there any other way we can reduce family members of bad karma?
Other people. So karma, of course, is personal. We can't transfer karma. We can't take someone's karma. We can't give karma. But what we can do, of course, is we can be either a positive or negative effect, support to other people. So we can, from our side, help support people so that they reduce their harm and increase their good actions. In that sense, we can help other people. I mean, if we could do that, we'd all be enlightened now because the Buddha would have taken all of our bad karma from us already.
So you've spoken about conservation of consciousness. Does that mean that it can be quantified?
Quantified.
Like, is there a limited amount? Is it unlimited? How does it divide? Or
so remember the consciousness or mind in Buddhism is non-physical, so it has no physical properties, no spatial properties, no physical properties at all. So quantify, it's a bit of a physical thing, so it's a bit hard to use the word quantify. I mean, qualify in terms of is the consciousness has a lot of good habits or bad habits, and that we can do, but in terms of like how big is it or something, that doesn't make any sense.
Then isn't conservation then usually applied to things that can be quantified?
Well, the
like
conservation
energy.
of mass energy, exactly. But we're talking non-physical here.
What's the Buddhist view on killing a terrorist to save hundreds of lives?
Well, better is if we could just simply stop them without killing them.
And if you can't?
Well, of course, then we use wisdom and compassion. I mean, if they're really about to push the button to blow up 1,000 people and the only way we can stop them is to terminate them, then okay, we make that decision.
Okay.
But generally, we say, oh, they're a bad guy, I really don't like them, I'm going to kill them. I mean, that's not good for us.
But if the intention is only good, then it's okay.
Well, but we have to use wisdom. You know, we can't justify killing people just because we think they're bad. I mean, maybe we can, because actually, often people who behave badly, if we can not kill them and restrain them, and if we can actually educate them to see that they're often the champions of that then. They often become the big spokesman about not doing harmful things. I mean, that would be the best, but of course we have to evaluate the situation.
Is karma just applied for humans?
Sorry?
Just for humans or chimpanzees or the other
That's
species of
tomorrow. We'll talk. So the short answer is yes, for all sentient beings. A question over here.
Yes, in Buddhism you say a lot about intentions that are like the actions and the motivation. You believe in intuition because you never say, or there is another kind of word that you mentioned?
Yeah. I mean, real intuition, I think, is just wisdom, inner wisdom. What we need to be careful of course, is people say, oh yeah, it was my intuition. But sometimes it's just a little ego in the ear trying to convince you of doing things that you shouldn't be doing, and you say, oh, it was my intuition, I followed my intuition. So just because it seems like intuition, we need to check. I mean, real intuition is coming from deep within our mind, and it's basically wisdom, inner wisdom. And we're going to touch more about that later. Okay, last question.
You can do something to clean your bad karma.
Yeah, purification, and that's the topic for tomorrow. Last question, then we really need to stop.
Whatever to happen to us, even injustice?
Sorry?
Whatever to happen to us is karma, even injustice?
Injustice?
Yeah. So if we suffer an injustice, would that be
Even
karma?
injustice done to us is a bad karma.
Right, so again, we have to understand these Buddhist principles of multiple lives. If we think that everything's happening in this life, then of course it won't make sense.
But it's our karma.
But not everything that happens is karma. I mean, physical things in the world, tree falling is not our karma. That's not karma. That's physical world of causality. Sorry? Well, if we were suffering, that would be, but not the tree falling is not karma. That's just physical causality. Okay, we really need to stop there. We've run over time a bit. So tomorrow, as I briefly mentioned, we're going to now look at the whole death rebirth process in Buddhism. And so we're going to, in your booklet, we're going to cover page 8. And then also, in the afternoon, we're going to use this chart here on page 22 and 23 to look at the whole cosmology according to Buddhism. So that's the afternoon topic tomorrow. And now, at 5:30 with Felipe, you'll be doing a meditation on attachment, understanding attachment also, but how to deal with attachment as well. And then this evening, continue that shamatha practice of nostrils and also some another loving kindness practice. Tomorrow morning before breakfast, to continue with the shamatha nostrils and also a compassion practice. So that's the meditations coming up. So let's take a break. You can come back 5:30 and I'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.